Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Intisar Rab. I'm a professor here at the law school in the history department, and I'm the director of the Islamic Legal Studies program, Sharia Source, which is hosting this lunch talk. And we are so pleased to have you here, as well as to have Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl here to speak to us today about something that he's written about recently. He's published a book, Reasoning with God, and some of the, what he talks about today will be a teaser into some of the larger arguments that are made in the book. And so it's also perhaps an invitation for you to check out more of his work. A little bit about Dr. Abou El Fadl. He's a leading authority on Islamic law and Islam, and he's also on the advisory board for this institution for the Islamic Legal Studies program, Sharia Source. So it's an especially nice welcome that we'd like to extend to him. He's also a prominent scholar in the field of human rights and of national security. He is the Omar and Esmeralda Alfi Distinguished Professor in Islamic Law at the UCLA Law School, where I had the opportunity to see him last semester, where I was doing some research and was enriched by our exchanges there. He teaches courses in international human rights, Islamic jurisprudence, national security law, law and terrorism, Islam and human rights, political asylum, and political crimes and legal systems. So a very wide set of expertise. And he's also the chair of the Islamic Studies interdepartmental program at UCLA. He's won various awards which are far too lengthy to go down if we want to hear from him, but I would just point out that he's a recipient of numerous awards, the author of 14 books, of dozens of articles, over 50, on various topics in Islam, Islamic law, and Islamic history. And one of the marks of his scholarship is to look at the intersection of law and morality, which, as you know, is typically separated in the legal positivistic way that we approach law in American law schools today. And so here's a look at a way that we can approach the law from a different perspective. Finally, Dr. Abou El Fadl was educated at Yale University with his BA. He received a JD from the University of Pennsylvania and an MA and a PhD from Princeton University under the tutelage of Professor Hossein Modarresi, who's the leading scholar of Islamic law and who was also my professor. So it's sort of like Dumbledore's army here. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Abou El Fadl, and he'll speak for a while, perhaps 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll try to leave some time at the end for any questions or comments you may have.
Thank you so much, Intisar. This is culled mostly from my most recent book, Reasoning with God, although it's been out for a couple of years. So I leave the elaborations to the book. So I start with the linguistic Shari'ah, or the root word of Sharia. And perhaps a natural point of view, or a natural point of beginning is the linguistic practice that we find in the Quranic text. And here I think the beginning would be the form in which the word itself is used in the Quran. It occurs in the context of Shara'a lakum, or as the verse 42:13 starts, goes, Shara'a lakum, God has decreed upon you the same commandment that God has given Noah. And what we have revealed to you is what we had enjoined upon Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. Elsewhere, it occurs as Shari'ah wa minhaja. We send to you the scripture was truth, confirming the scriptures that came before it, and was final authority over them. So judge between them according to what God has sent you. And do not follow their whims so that you may deviate, so you may not deviate from the truth that has been sent to you. We have assigned a path, shara, and way, wa minhaj. If God would have willed, God would have made but a single nation, but compete in God in good deeds, and so on. This is 548. The third occurrence of the word shara in the Quran, it occurred in the expression shari'atan min al-amr in 45:18. Now we have sent to you a sure path, shari'atan min al-amr, so follow it and do not follow the whims of those without knowledge. Now, in the Quranic text, interpretively, it seems to connote a path and a methodology, perhaps, without any further elaborations, and definitely does not, in and by itself, in the Quranic practice, connote anything like the full-fledged Islamic legal system and jurisprudential system that takes centuries to develop afterwards. But as numerous Muslim classical scholars have insisted, like Ibn Miskawayh, Ibn al-Khatib, al-Tawhidi, and Raghib al-Asfahani, and many others, Sharia would not congeal as a concept and would not be rooted unless it is tied to the notion of deputyship or viceroyship, a social contract of sorts between God and human beings. And in this thinking, human beings are seen as honored and celebrated because they are capable of godlike things. They obviously are not deities, but they take after the image of God. Melchert has an article in the Journal of Quranic Studies exploring the discourse on the idea of human beings being created in God's image, with much reservations that I have on Melchert's conclusions, but it's a nice investigation of that part of the tradition that in modernity is often ignored. So human beings are honored according to the Quranic text and according to the interpretive traditions, and celebrated because they are godlike. In many narratives in the Islamic tradition, there's emphasis on God creating humans in husn, or in beauty. And according to various interpretive methodologies, this in itself is sufficient to obligate human beings to act in husn, or in beauty, to make their external beauty as bearers of God's image, reflective of an inner beauty, as Al-Ghazali puts it, Hamid al-Ghazali. In another Quranic parable, God is said to have offered the trust and amana to all of creation, but ultimately it was shouldered only by human beings. The Quran then somberly notes that bearing this trust is such an onerous and arduous task. I believe that this weighty trust of which human beings were honored and dignified is the marvel of divinity itself. Human beings, as I argue in reasoning with God, are but nuances of the divine, inexhaustible anecdotes of divinity, capable of creating immeasurable acts of beauty. As human beings invent and create beauty, they move towards a majestic caliphate of godliness, Elohiyah. However, as I argue in reasoning with God, when human beings no longer seek or create beauty, forget their bonds to the ethereal and sublime, and slump into indolence and despair, they drift further away from godliness to its antithesis. According to the Quranic text, God is the light of the heavens of the earth, light upon light. In every act of beauty, in every nuance that commemorates the truth of our divine nature and memorializes the calfit of humanity in the world, we move closer to the divine light. But in remaining static, in existing without beautification or in false beautification, in subsisting without service born out of love, mercy, compassion, i.e. without the attributes and nuances of divinity, we no longer move towards the light, and in fact drift from the possibility of godliness to the darkness of godlessness. Visceral worship and trust and bearing witness on behalf of God in justice, even if it is against our own self-interests, according to the Quranic text. So, what can we make of the meaning of Sharia with this background? In reasoning with God, I argue that Sharia should be properly understood strictly as the equivalent of the virtues of godliness, as the higher ideals of society and humanity at large. When the Quran states, for instance, do good, for God loves those who do good, it uses the plural form, وَأَحْسِنُوا, or all of you people do or perform ihsan, a command form to do acts of beauty or acts of husn or ihsan. In this, the Quran has provided a textual grounding for the rational and natural moral imperative of acting to achieve goodness. As Raghib al-Asfahani, who is from the 12th century AD, argued centuries ago, that people have a rational obligation to live up to the privilege of having inherited the earth collectively. In terms of the duty to do good, this amounts to an obligation to adopt godly virtues, or as Raghib al-Asfahani puts it, التخلق بخلق الله. And as Ibn Qayyim notes, he's from the 14th century, a couple of centuries later, that the ethics of goodness, khuluq, is embodied in the simple principles of justice, wisdom, welfare, and truthfulness. Now, of course, add to this the thought of Ibn Miskawayh, or Imam Tawhidi, and many others who elaborate on the basic notion of virtue ethics as essential to that covenant between human beings and God. The attributes of God acknowledge the characteristics of goodness. We human beings, as trustees on this earth, we human beings are the trustees on this earth, and so without limitations, possibilities, and potentialities define the epistemologies and deontological implications of these divine attributes. So for instance, I know that as a Muslim, that among God's attributes are mercy, compassion, justice, forgiveness, and so on. Furthermore, reason and revelation impose these attributes as obligations in a variety of some circumstances, some of which will require that I reflect upon the necessity of two things: balance and proportionality in the application of these attributes. It is with these two provisos, balance and proportionality, that will ultimately allow for a reflective and deliberative process on what good character means or should mean. The perpetual process is to reaffirm goodness, but aspire towards godliness. If Sharia is understood from this perspective, it will not only allow us to empower ourselves with rational morality, but also continue to be inspired and moved by the promise of divine beauty. Understanding Sharia in this sense as a set of natural virtues, and I use here natural virtues anchored in the tradition of philosophical natural goodness, anchored further in the thoughts of Ibn Miskawayh and Aristotelian logic to a large extent. understanding the Sharia as a set of natural virtues and adopting it as a normative guide in this sense represents an affirmation of moral character and the identity of a people, the continuity of an Islamic heritage and tradition, but also a renewed search for common ground with humanity at large, which shares the responsibility for the well-being and flourishing of the earth as a collective inheritance of humanity. We adopt principles based on divine teachings for the simple reason that we affirm the principle that we need God's grace, and we find dignity in submitting to divine guidance. And also, in principle, we want to affirm the duality of anchoring our aspirations upon the eschatology of God's laws and upon the collective guidance of accumulations of human wisdom. Instead of the chaotic crisis of identity, moral displacement, psychological alienation, disaffection, and uprootedness of modernized, globalized societies, Sharia, from this perspective, provides an ontological anchor based on the promises of humanity and divinity. Sharia is premised on an ontological conviction in virtue, particularly rational virtues, as a principle, and that there are good qualities of character that allow us to distinguish between the virtuous and the lack of it. From my perspective, and I argue in reasoning with God, that we as human beings perpetuate evil not because of the diabolical craftiness of the devil, but rather all we need is to forget the trust of the caliphate of humanity at large, in a covenantal relationship with a divine. We act ungodly by failing to do good. And in doing so, before long, darkness sets in. Here I'm reminded of Hannah Arendt's famous remark about the banality of evil, and certainly it is. But my question is, what precedes the banality of evil? What is the thoroughly compromised state that gets us there in the first place? What transpires with human beings to the point where we no longer see a higher version of ourselves, something other than being a mere peg in a stale and mundane virtual mill of dehumanization? The human soul soars when its own self-perceptions and existential consciousness drifts. Sorry, let's start that. The human soul sours when its own self-perceptions and existential consciousness drifts into a staleness and prosaicness of being. It moves through a series of corporal attainments impervious to its own ethereal truth, forgetful of the transcendent and obstinately defiant in recognizing the equal divinity of all. In other words, it no longer believes in its own beauty and goodness, or the beauty or goodness of others, and that's what precedes the banality of evil. In the Islamic tradition, although it took centuries for it to develop this distinction, but it ultimately did develop a distinction between al-hikmah al-ilahiyya and al-hikmah al-insaniyya, divine wisdom and human wisdom. Wisdom in the sphere of the divine, al-hikmah al-ilahiyya, is ontological and thoroughly abstract in the sense that it constitutes the knowledge of the true nature of all things. But al-hikmah al-insaniyya, at the human level, it is deontonic and practical in that it inquires into the ethical duties and obligations that follow from the nature of things. Although the boundaries of both spheres of wisdom overlap, al-hikmah al-ilahiyya is founded on certitude, while al-hikmah al-insaniyya, human wisdom, is very different. It is founded on probabilities and on circumspection, being circumspect and analytical. The critical point here is that all wisdom, all knowledge of virtues at the metaphysical level is anchored and affirmed in the principle of divinity. But all wisdom at the human level, hikmah ilahiyya, is created and a conduct of a practical deliberative experience, and it is unequivocally human. Effectively, this means that our knowledge of right from wrong is the inquiry into godliness, an inquiry into godliness. But our human efforts effectuating and materializing this knowledge from the pursuit of godliness is thoroughly human and thoroughly anchored in rational virtue. We search godliness assured of God's objective and absolute recognition and support of goodness in principle. But our human efforts remain just that, thoroughly human. This epistemological structure allows us to integrate Sharia in social and political life of Muslims as an aspiration, while guaranteeing God's immutability and absoluteness at the same time, not transgressing upon the principle itself, and not claiming to have become empowered and possessed of the al-hikmah al-ilahiyya, or the divine wisdom. Now here I move a little closer to law. Because of the overpowering role of culture and socialization in the invention and reproduction and reformulation of meaning, historical contexts play a pivotal role in determining tastes, emotion, worthiness of character, and even what society considers reasonable and rational. Ibn Raskawayh wrote at length about this. The construction of consciousness and knowledge is a prime function of socialization and also of any epistemological system. Epistemology is core to hermeneutics, phenomenology, deontology, but epistemology is contextually contingent, and any theology or legal theory that fails to take sufficient account of this fact does so at its own peril. Today, it is quite easy for Muslims to buy and read books of traditions for themselves. Whether they can make proper sense of these books of tradition is something else altogether. Thousands of original sources, which by their very nature are historically contingent and contextual, and which for centuries were accessible only to particular classes or segments of the population, are now electronically available at a simple press of the button, something that I have to admit I don't like. These, rather, from my perspective, unfortunate, irrepressible developments means that language is in a constant creative dynamic with numerous contingencies, including the nature of human consciousness, comprehension, expression, and articulations of selfhood. Although God is eternal, immutable, unalterable, at the same time, creation, nature, selfhood, epistemology are far from fixed in time and space. Creation, selfhood, epistemology are constantly defining and redefining one another. But the assertion of disembodied Islamic determination or rules in the modern age without the contextual legal processes, institutions, and epistemology, and in the absence of the legal cultures that generated these historical determinations in the first place, means that the relationship between the contemporary manifestations of Islamic law and the classical tradition has, to say the least, been disastrous, and nothing short of, in the modern age. Critically, these revolutionary shifts in the construction of human consciousness, self-awareness, and epistemology must have profound changes upon the way that religious communities approach and interpret their inherited text. Now, to argue that Sharia was always socio-historically embedded and contingent, and that it can only be made sense of, at least the historical practice Sharia, within the epistemological parameters of each age, and that it is a constant interpretive work. Is a critical point. I'm now going to jump over a lot of stuff that I delve into in Reasoning with God at great length, but for our purposes, it's just we don't have time. Here is the critical point that I want to make sure I do get to. That when the epistemological breach between a historical practice and modern consciousness increases, law, if asserted without full awareness of its historical functions and its historical legacy, assertion of legal frameworks become determinative and coercive. The more law stops making sense to its target audience, the more it overlooks the epistemological contingencies of the age, the more law has to resort to fictions of persuasiveness and apologetics about its own legitimacy, inflating its own legitimacy at the expense of social reality. And here, the more law ceases to be persuasive to its own audience, the more law is forced to undermine its own legitimacy by resorting to outright coercion. In my view, as I argue in Reasoning with God, that is the prevailing paradigm of Sharia in the modern age as a working legal system. Apologetics and coercion. Apologetics sustained by a system of despotism that allows the mythological Sharia as an Islamic legal system to continue existing. And if not apologetics, then outright coercion that ultimately undermines the very nature of the philosophical system, if what I argue that it is based on virtue ethics is accepted. Now, having said all of this, there is a critical point, and especially in more recent developments, and here I'm just going to, something that I don't talk about in Reasoning with God, that this process, whether we are talking about the engagements with the traditions of people such as Raghab al-Asfahani, or Ibn Miskawayh, or Tawhidi, or even Hamid al-Ghazali, leave alone Ibn Rushd. These processes of reflection and discourse upon Sharia that we talk about in recent times, and in the, especially, to be blunt about it and rather vulgar, since the rise of Trump and his allies in the Middle East, has become this discourse, this process of reflection, this process of thinking about Sharia as a paradigm, has become thoroughly skewed and even corrupted. That the rise of the politics of fear and dread, and maybe we'll elaborate upon this in the Q&A if you want. The rise of the politics of fear and dread in discourses about so-called political Islam, whatever that means, and the ambiguity of the concept itself, has, in many ways, the type of discourse that I present in Reasoning with God has become, in the present climate, an untenable discourse and inaccessible. It is sufficient for a Muslim who even attempts to think about Sharia as a paradigm, with the accusation of political Islam standing as a constant oppressive force for the entire discourse and the entire thought process to be silenced. And that is a reality since the so-called Arab Spring and what has ensued from it. And let me stop.
Thank you very much. I want to take moderator's privilege here and just ask a couple of questions to perhaps get us started. And one has to do with elaborating on your last point, which is, so you talked about about apologetics and coercion being features of modern versions or iterations of corrupted versions of Islamic law as they appear in the modern world. And I'm wondering if you could say something more about two things. One, how can we think about thought and practice of Islamic law in a Western context where if we say that apologetics are off the table because there may be private practices or grappling with Islamic law, and that there's no sense of coercion. Is there some extent to which, and it seemed like there were tones of this in what you talked about, to which knowledge of Islamic law or accessibility of it helps create the reality of its thought and practice in a Western context? And then two, what would you have us do about the very last point you made? Islamic law being, sort of lending itself to the flames that appear in the age of fear.
Well, first, what is Islamic law? And that's, I don't understand any legal system, including Islamic law, as a set of positive commands. Legal systems, by their nature, are not a collection of positive commands. A code of law is not a legal system. It is simply the product. What does define a legal system for me is a tradition of linguistic practices and deliberative, reflective processes that uses a specialized language. Now, can a legal system exist even if it has no followers? Can it be simply a deliberative practice or the deliberative, reflective language that thinks through examples that is simply a historical curiosity? There's absolutely no significance sociologically. In theory, in abstract, yes, I think it can. You can have it purely just, you can imagine, we can talk about a legal system that is simply a historical phenomena with absolutely no consequences and beyond its historical moment. So, okay, why do I start with this? Is because from that perspective, why do we even talk about Islamic law in the West? You could study Islamic law as a historical phenomenon, and that's how it's approached by so many scholars. But if you are a lawyer working from within the legal system, not because we are interested in any of the positive commandments of the Islamic legal system being enforced in the West, and in fact I even doubt that we are interested, or I would even argue we ought not be interested in any of the positive legal commandments, but because we are interested in understanding this deliberative practice that constitutes the legal system. And to be quite frank about it, in the past 2 or 3 decades, the reason thinking about Islamic law flourished in the West is because of the relative freedom, the relative space made available to us. I mean, the only reason someone like me or others, many others, ended up in the West talking about Islamic law rather than Egypt or Jordan or whatever is because of the oppressive environment where that Islamic legal system takes sort of a natural, native uprootedness and the relative freedom that is available in the West. So, I'm not sure I even answered your question, but I'm talking more about a stream of consciousness.
The nature of Islamic law, and then what to do about it.
And what to do about it, I'm not sure, except say this, that what is a true loss, I think that the growth of Islamic thinking about the Islamic legal system, even the scholarship of someone like Wa al-Halal, has had an enormous impact on culture going from legal thinking about Islamic law from the West to the Muslim world. In recent developments in the West, the politics of dread, the Islamophobia that has exploded upon the scene has marginalized that discourse and marginalized it to very extreme, and I'm not sure what to do about it. I mean, can we really respond to Islamophobia? Can we try to temper Islamophobia? Can we try to get a rational discourse about Islamic law in the West? I'm not sure.
There's some time for other questions, comments, objections. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that you don't like how many of these older historical documents are now available in the Bible.
That I'm committed to putting online.
I thought that was a very interesting idea, and I wonder, in your opinion, what is the appropriate level of accessibility?
Well, I mean, that was sort of a, you can't really go against the movement of history. You know, not liking it is not liking email. I hate email, right? But what am I going to do about it? It is what it is. But my issue is that Islamic law continues, and especially by people who have not thought about the nature of legal systems, and especially from a comparative perspective, it continues to be, the focus continues to be on the positive commandments, and taking that as representative of the legal system. And the thrust, which was aborted centuries ago, but the thrust of Sharia as virtue ethics, and that type of deliberative thinking that attempted to interrogate the very roots of why we have positive commandments, why do we have a wajib, an obligation. People like some Western scholars have called it the rise of secular humanism in the Islamic tradition. I don't like that expression. I don't think it was the rise of secular humanism. It was definitely a rise of some type of humanism. But the emphasis on Islamic law as a code-like entity or being, it further distances us, further alienates us from that tradition of virtue ethics that at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, we seemed like we're going to reclaim that tradition in a certain historical moment, but that moment has long passed, and we are far from reclaiming that tradition now. I don't know too many students of Islamic law that are interested in the writings of Ibn Miskawayh or Ibn Aqil and the like. In fact, when I get students of Islamic law and I tell them that you begin your study of Islamic law by reading works on virtue ethics, often the reaction you get is, well, how is that related to Islamic law? How is that related to law? In my view, that's the essence of law. without it, you don't have law. You just have a code.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk, Professor. I was wondering about the awareness, and in terms of the writing of some of these figures, but also, like, I'm curious about their awareness or emphasis on what you're saying. Do you feel that you're re-emphasizing sort of their perspective on virtue ethics being sort of the basis underlying Islamic law also, and was that a dominant view or a competitive view on a lot of history, and or do you feel that you have read this, that this is obvious even though it's not being necessarily articulated?
It depends on what historical period, because
Right. And was there a shift recently?
No, okay. You have someone like Hamid al-Ghazali in the Sunni context has an enormous impact. The work of Ihya al-Ulumuddin is really, in many ways, an attempt to Islamize virtue ethics and to Ibn Miskawayh was very much openly indebted to the Aristotelian tradition. Hamid al-Ghazali takes Ibn Miskawayh and his whole Aristotelian approach to virtue ethics and Islamizes it as sort of the Puritans of the modern age. They go through Ihya al-Ulumuddin and they say, oh, look, all the hadiths he's using are not authentic, and weak from a hadith perspective. But Hamid al-Ghazali, part of what he did was quite consciously use any hadith, co-opt any possible tradition that's out there to Islamize virtue ethics. Now, the impact of someone like Hamid al-Ghazali was enormous. But did it wane? So if you take during the historical period of Ibn Taymiyyah, who was very much suspect of virtue ethics and uncomfortable with it. But Ibn Taymiyyah is equaled out in a sense by Ibn Qayyim, who was very much in favor of virtue ethics at the heart and soul of Sharia, and thinking about Sharia. It didn't work out the program as thoroughly as we would like, but made leaps and bounds, although he's often misread and misunderstood by modern Muslims. My biggest pet peeve is that, or biggest problem, is that while you found people like Abdul Halim Mahmoud, who, the Sheikh of Azhar in the beginning of this century, he went back and recognized that the only venue for Sharia to engage humanity at large is to rekindle virtue ethics and the tradition of virtue ethics rooted in the Aristotelian tradition in Islam. Where is the writings of people like Shaltut or Abdul Halim Mahmoud, or as opposed to, if you compare them to the writings of Maududi or even Ali Shariati, who comes from a very dogmatic and a very apologetic perspective, and it looks for certitudes rather than possibilities and investigations. And especially, I had a brief, like many intellectuals, many other Muslim intellectuals, had a brief moment of optimism during the Arab Spring, engaging a lot of Egyptian intellectuals and Tunisian intellectuals at the time who basically summed up Sharia in Aish Hurriya, Karam and Saniya, bread, liberty, and dignity, and recognizing this is not the trend, the way that the Arab Spring has been handled afterwards has been a major intellectual setback. And I'm not sure if we will recover from it for decades, maybe a century. Maybe I'm a pessimist, but the sheer violence that has been inflicted to punish any type of attempts to reassert the tradition and co-opt it, emphasize the logic of despotism and the privileged position of apologetics as the only way to approach the Islamic tradition, either apologetics or despotism. And you either have to fit yourself to either of these two. I see it as having a very chilling effect. It takes an enormous amount of bravery for any intellectual today to talk about anything related to Sharia. I mean, I don't know, maybe bravery just flows in your blood naturally, but, I feel the, I don't know if Intisar feels the dread, but I feel the dread all the time.
Well, we should stop because it's a little past 1, although I think we'll hang around here for a few more minutes, but I want to keep in mind,
She has a class at 1:30.
you end on such a dark note. I want to keep in mind what you began with, that the other side of darkness is light, and sort of what frames the whole discussion. And so in that way, and where we began, and thank you.